Now, Christian commentaries here have to do some handstands and some somersaults to make sense of this. Meaning, what is the connection between purchasing a sword and the verse in Isaiah which says that the servant of the Lord will be numbered with the transgressors? There doesn't seem to be any connection whatsoever. However, Christian apologists and commentaries want to spin this passage, doesn't really seem to flow. And I suspect that if Jesus actually did say this here, and I seriously doubt it, I seriously doubt that in the middle of this conversation with his disciples about Satan coming to tempt them and the need to buy swords, he's going to all of a sudden, out of the blue, say, and it needs to be fulfilled, this verse in Isaiah chapter 53. It doesn't sound really like it's something that he would have said, but his followers would have had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. Now, this is also a very, very strange passage. According to Luke and the other synoptic gospels, the holiday of Passover had begun. According to the synoptic gospels, this discussion between Jesus and his disciples is taking place either at the Passover Seder, the evening of Passover, or shortly after the Seder had concluded. And taking a purse of money or buying things would have been prohibited. People were not allowed to buy and sell on the holiday.
Welcome to TaNaCh Talk. I'm your host, William Hull, broadcasting live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with another episode of Rabbi Cross-Examines the New Testament with Rabbi Michael "The Man" Skobac. Welcome back, our dear Rebbe. How are you doing today, sir?
Thank God, doing very well.
Baruch Hashem.
And it's awesome to be back here with you. Last week, I was actually in the United States of America. I don't travel that much these days, but I went.
You came all the way to America, and you didn't come to say hi.
Well, I was in a different.
I know.
In a different part of
it's still
America.
Like being out of the country, and New York is like it might as well be out of the country.
I was in Detroit.
Oh wow, nice, very nice.
Yeah, I was in the Motor City.
How about that? Very good.
Yeah.
All right, so we're picking up on part 2 of Luke 22. And what verse? You said 31 is where we need to pick up at?
So we left off last time at verse 30. So we're going to start today at 31.
Okay, let me stop sharing the screen because it's not letting me move the screen by doing it. Let me do this. Confirm stop sharing. And we can continue this, no problem.
Sharing is caring.
Sure enough.
Okay, so before we get started, just mention that part 1 that we did last time. So basically, what takes place in the first 30 verses of chapter 22 is that it discusses this plot that Judas Iscariot gets involved with. He's basically brought into a conspiracy to betray Jesus. He agrees to take part in it. And then, for the most part, what is discussed is the preparations for the Passover meal, and it discusses the Passover meal, what we call the Passover Seder. So that's basically what takes place in the first 30 verses. And we did a very thorough analysis of that, and we're going to continue now with verse 31. So basically, we'll take these verses as pairs. Verses 31 and 32, I'll just read it, and then we'll just mention something about it. So Jesus says, he's addressing Peter now. Peter's what he's been calling someone named Simon for a long time, but now he goes back to calling him by his original name. So he says, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan has demanded permission to sift you like wheat, but I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. And you, when you have turned again, meaning I guess when you've repented, strengthen your brethren, strengthen your brothers. So again, Jesus here is speaking to Peter, or sometimes referred to as Simon Peter, here simply Simon. And he says that Satan has demanded permission to sift you like wheat. Now, problem here is that Satan is basically, in the TaNaCh, an angel of God who acts as an agent of God. Satan is not an independent operator in the TaNaCh. And he doesn't hatch his own independent initiatives in the TaNaCh. He doesn't come up with his own plans. But again, you have to appreciate that the Gospels are written in some respects. Obviously, at this time when they're being written, Christian theology has not been fully developed. But there is at least this idea that we find in the Gospels themselves that Satan is essentially an independent operator. And the Christian idea is that Satan is a fallen angel that rebelled against the Almighty, rebelled against God, and was cast down out of heaven and took with him, many other angels that became the demons. So in the Christian Bible, Satan does play, in a sense, an independent role. Basically, he leads a team against God. That's why there's a dualism in Christian theology. The world is this battle between God and Satan. And we know that in the Christian Bible, you'll find this in the Gospel of John, Satan is called the god of this world. So here you have basically something which is very out of step with the TaNaCh and with Jewish thinking on the whole topic, the whole question of who Satan is. And you have here Satan coming up, hatching his own plot and coming up with his own initiative to take Peter, to take Simon Peter. And this is really, again, another example of the Christian Bible being out of step with the TaNaCh and with Jewish thinking. So in verses 33 and 34, Simon Peter says to Jesus, "Lord, with you I am ready to go to both prison and to death." He basically says to Jesus, look, you're concerned about my soul, you're concerned about Satan taking me over. He says to Jesus, I'm ready to go to the mat for you. I'm ready to go to both prison and to death. And he said, I say to you, Peter, the cock will not crow today until you have denied me, until you've denied me 3 times that you know me. Now, when Jesus says the cock will not crow today, you have to remember that this is taking place at night. The Passover Seder has either just ended or they're in the middle of the Seder, but this is taking place in the evening. So what Jesus is saying is, look, Peter, you might be professing your loyalty to me, but I'm telling you that before the day comes up, meaning that when does the rooster crow, when does the cock crow? It's at daybreak, when the morning arrives. So that's what Jesus is saying. He's saying that, despite the fact that you're claiming so much loyalty to me, I'm telling you that you're going to deny that you even know me 3 times before the cock is going to crow and the next morning begins. Now, this is a very strange thing to say to Simon Peter. I think it's an unusual thing to tell someone. The prophets of God in the TaNaCh did not foretell that an individual would sin. That's what basically Jesus is saying here. He's telling Peter that he's essentially going to sin. That's not what the prophets of the TaNaCh did. It's true that sometimes God warned the nation that they would turn away from him. That does happen in the TaNaCh, but it doesn't apply to any specific generation, meaning that this is a general prediction that God is making, and it's not condemning, in a sense, any particular people. It could be this generation, it could be that generation. But the prophets did not take a person and basically paint them into a box and say, you are going to do the wrong thing. That's very, very unlike anything a prophet in the TaNaCh would say. Free will basically would insist that it will not be me or even a generation. Free will could say that, no, it's not going to be my generation that's going to turn away from God. And certainly an individual always had free will not to turn away. So Jesus here, if his prophecy is genuine, meaning if Jesus really knows, if he really knows the future, and he really knows that Peter is going to turn away from him and deny him 3 times, it would be interfering with Simon's free will, because he's essentially saying this is what's going to happen, in which case Simon Peter doesn't have any choice. And if it would be revealed that if it turned out that Simon Peter did not deny Jesus 3 times, if it wouldn't happen, then it would be revealed sort of after the fact that Jesus was not saying the truth, that Jesus was a false prophet. So the whole encounter is very peculiar. For any prophet to say something like this to someone is pretty bizarre. In verses 35 to 36, he says to them, when I sent you out, now he's saying now to his disciples, when I sent you out without a purse and without a bag and without sandals, you did not lack anything, he says to his disciples. Did you? And they said, no, nothing. They said, we didn't lack anything. And he said to them now, but now let him who has a purse take it along, likewise a bag, and let him who has no sword sell his robe, sell his garment, and buy one, and purchase a sword. Now, this is also a very, very strange passage. According to Luke and the other synoptic gospels, the holiday of Passover had begun. According to the synoptic gospels, this discussion between Jesus and his disciples is taking place either at the Passover Seder, the evening of Passover, or shortly after the Seder had concluded. And taking a purse of money or buying things would have been prohibited. People were not allowed to buy and sell on the holiday. We see this, by the way, in the prophet, in the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah speaks specifically about the prohibition of buying and selling. Now, according to John, according to the Gospel of John, the so-called Last Supper was not a Passover Seder. It took place the day before Passover, in which case these activities of having a purse and carrying money and buying things would not have been a problem. But according to the Synoptic Gospels, which has this story taking place on the first day of Passover, this would have been a very, very peculiar thing for Jesus to say. Now, the command to purchase swords is also strange, because soon we're going to see when Jesus is being arrested, one of his disciples, according to the book of John, it's Peter, uses his sword to attack one of those coming for Jesus. And in Matthew's version of the incident, Jesus says to this person, to Peter, put away your sword, for all who take up the sword shall perish by the sword. That's Matthew chapter 26, verse 52. So it's peculiar because here in Luke, Jesus is basically directing his disciples to purchase, to have a sword ready. And if you don't have one, even sell your garment, sell your cloak in order to purchase a sword. Well, that's a pretty provocative request to make. Normally, when people think of carrying weapons, they don't think of carrying the weapon as an ornament. They think of carrying the weapon as a weapon to be used at least in self-defense, if not for offense. And Peter does what would be normal. Here there's a big mob that's coming to arrest Jesus, and Peter unsheaths his sword and lops off the ear of the servant of the high priest. It doesn't seem like he's doing anything inappropriate according to the instructions of Jesus. But for some reason in Matthew, Jesus seems to basically negate the whole idea of having a sword in the first place. He says, he who takes up the sword will perish by the sword. So there's a bit of what we call a mixed message being related in the Gospels. In verse 37, Jesus says, "For I tell you, today, that which is written must be fulfilled in me," and he was numbered with the transgressors. So Jesus at this point turns to his disciples and says, I want you to know that that which was written has to be fulfilled in me. And he quotes a verse from Isaiah chapter 53, I believe verse 12, but I may be wrong. But he quotes the verse which says, and he was numbered with the transgressors. So this verse is also somewhat awkward. The flow of the passage seems to indicate that his disciples had to arm themselves with swords because it would fulfill Isaiah 53, verse 12, that God's servant will be numbered with the transgressors. That's the flow of the verse. Again, in verse 36, he commands them to buy a sword. And in verse 37, the next verse, he says, because you have to realize that what has to be fulfilled is this verse in Isaiah. So it sounds like the purchase of the swords is crucial for the fulfillment of this verse in Isaiah. Now, Christian commentaries here, therefore, have to do some handstands and some somersaults to make sense of this. Meaning, what is the connection between purchasing a sword and the verse in Isaiah, which says that the servant of the Lord will be numbered with the transgressors? There doesn't seem to be any connection whatsoever. But this is clearly a very difficult read. However, Christian apologists and commentaries want to spin this passage, it doesn't really seem to flow neatly. And I suspect that if Jesus actually did say this here, and I seriously doubt it, I seriously doubt that in the middle of this conversation with his disciples about Satan coming to tempt them and the need to buy swords, he's going to all of a sudden, out of the blue, say, and it needs to be fulfilled, this verse in Isaiah chapter 53. It doesn't sound really like it's something that he would have said, but his followers would have had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. Meaning this would have been the kind of verse where they would have rolled their eyes and they would have said, what in the world is he talking about? So in verse 38, they said, look, here are two swords. He just told them to make sure you have a sword. If you don't have one, sell your garment and purchase a sword. And they say, look, here are two swords. And he says to them, it's enough. Now, that's, again, a mysterious phrase. What does he mean, it's enough? Does it mean that one would have been enough? Is he saying that two are enough? If he had already told his disciples to make sure that if they don't have a sword, go buy one, well, it's possible that, and it's likely, that none of them would be carrying a sword. They're going to a Passover meal, so that if everyone was going to sell their garment and purchase a sword, which again is absurd because there are no places to purchase swords on Passover. People didn't carry money on Passover. He wouldn't have told them. I mean, anyway, The whole thing really doesn't sound like it's nonfiction. I remember many, many years ago at one of the university libraries here in Toronto, the university library brought in a book that spoke about the idea that the Holocaust never happened. And there was a big controversy, a big scandal. How could you have a book like that in a public university library? So what they did was they classified the book under fiction. That's how they handled the situation. So it doesn't sound like this is a nonfiction narrative, because the whole thing just doesn't read well. It doesn't make any sense. So here, it's not clear what he means by saying it's enough. Many Christian commentaries say that, again, it doesn't make any sense what they're saying, but they say that what he means is it's enough of this talk about swords. What are you talking about swords for? We're not into violence. Now, again, he's the one that brought up the whole topic of swords. He's the one that brought up the request that they make sure that they purchase one. So it's very hard to accept the way many Christian commentaries understand this phrase of it is enough, meaning that why you keep on talking about swords. That it doesn't read at all like that. David Stern, in his commentary to this passage, says Jesus is saying now, you've taken me too literally. I'm not thinking about swords. End the conversation. Enough already. That's one of the commentaries who takes this approach, that Jesus is telling them just quit the conversation about swords. But this is absolutely bizarre, because they weren't having the conversation about swords. They didn't start the discussion about swords. Jesus was the one that began speaking about swords, and about even selling their cloaks to buy a sword if they didn't have one. All they did was to say to him in response, look, we've already found 2 swords. So it's impossible to really understand the flow of the conversation here. And if Jesus was not talking about swords, as David Stern insists, David Stern says, you're taking me too literally. I'm not talking about swords. So if he wasn't speaking about swords, then why did he speak about purchasing a sword, selling your garment? How else should they have understood what he was saying? How else should they have understood what he was saying? In verse 39, this text says that he came out and proceeded, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples also followed him. And then in verse 40, and when he arrived at the place, he said to them, pray that you may not enter into temptation. And the passage goes on and says in verse 41, and he withdrew from them about a stone's throw away, and he knelt down and began to pray. Now, believe it or not, kneeling was a posture that had been used by Jews in prayer at times. There are many prayer postures that we find in the Hebrew Bible. Bowing down completely was sometimes a prayer posture. And kneeling we see in Psalm 95, verse 6. We see kneeling in Daniel chapter 6, verse 11. And we see kneeling in 2 Chronicles chapter 6, verse 13. So it was not an unusual posture to assume in prayer. Now, another clear indication that Jesus was not God is the fact that he's praying here. Normally, human beings pray to God. It doesn't make any sense at all that God's going to pray to himself, or that a person of the Trinity is going to pray to a second person of the Trinity. We often hear Christians claim that this was an expression of Jesus' humanity, meaning that you have so many passages in the Christian Bible where it's just impossible to understand Jesus as being God in certain passages. And so the knee-jerk Christian reaction is often, well, that Jesus was a human being. God basically came and became incarnated into the human being, Jesus of Nazareth. So they speak about the fact that Jesus has both a human identity and a God identity. And so they neatly will take passages like this, where Jesus is praying to God, and they say, well, this is obviously not the divine Jesus, Jesus as God praying. This is the human Jesus that's praying. And this sort of apologetic, this rationalization, this explanation, it really fails to impress, because you can't have a being that's, in a sense, it's like it switches on and off as God or not God, binary choice. If a being is God, then this being is not human at all. God and human beings do not have anything in common, in a sense. So if the person is a human being, they're not God. By definition, a human being is not God. And by definition, God is not a human being. So this whole idea that Jesus is able to flip back and forth between a human identity and a godly identity simply does not make any sense. In verse 42, Jesus prays now. This is the prayer of Jesus. Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done. That's the prayer of Jesus. Now, how is it possible for Jesus to ask God to spare him of the fate that is awaiting him? How could Jesus pray for this? Now, again, if it was the divine Jesus that's speaking, it doesn't make any sense that he's asking God of anything. But if it is the divine Jesus that's speaking, how could his will be different from that of the Father? He's saying, but not according to my will. It's got to be according to your will. So it's very, very impossible to see this as Jesus being God, praying to God, and having a different will than God. And how could he even think about not fulfilling his biblically mandated mission of dying to atone for the sins of the world? Meaning, Jesus here is praying that God spare him of the fate that's awaiting him. Remove the cup from me. I'm not up for this mission of dying on the cross. And so it's impossible to read this passage as a divine Jesus that's praying to God. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But even if he was merely speaking as a human Jesus, if this was his human side that's speaking and praying to God, how could he not have been aware of the fact that suffering and dying was the entire reason that God sent him into the world, and that salvation of humanity depended upon it? So how is it possible that he would just not be aware of the fact that his entire purpose for being in the world was to die as a sacrifice, was to suffer and die as a sacrifice? It's a very, very difficult passage to understand. And in verse 43, we're told that now an angel from heaven appeared to Jesus, and strengthened him. So again, this is another passage that completely refutes any notion of the deity of Jesus. God does not need to be strengthened by an angel. And that forces Christians to read passages like this with a view of a multiple personality Jesus, where Jesus again flips back and forth between being human and being divine. In verses 47 to 48, we're told that while he was still speaking to his disciples, a large crowd came. And the one called Judas, one of the 12, was preceding them. So at the front of this mob, at the front of this big crowd, is Judas. And he approached Jesus to kiss him. But Jesus said to him, Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? Now, Christian missionaries insist that this was a fulfillment of the messianic prophecy in the book of Psalms, chapter 41, verse 10. It would be chapter 41, verse 9 in a Christian Bible, where the speaker in this psalm says, even my close friend in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted up his heel against me. And many, many Christian missionaries insist that this is a messianic prophecy fulfilled by Jesus. I remember many years ago, Chosen People Ministries published a tract called 37, I think. I'm forgetting the number, 37 prophecies fulfilled in one day. Or 33 actually was the second version. I think it was originally 37, and then they knocked it down to 33, maybe because of passages like this. But they put out a tract basically speaking about 33 or 37 prophecies fulfilled in one day. And the first one they list is this one from Psalm chapter 41, that the betrayal of Jesus by Judas Iscariot didn't just happen to take place. It was prophesied in the TaNaCh that the Messiah would be betrayed by a close friend. Now, there's a boatload of problems with this assertion. Number one, Psalm 41 is not a messianic prophecy. There's nothing in the text. If you study the entire chapter, read the entire chapter of Psalm 41, there's nothing in the text that indicates that speaking about the Messiah. And the fact is that no one, not one person reading this psalm before the story about Jesus, meaning if someone was reading this psalm 100 years or 50 years before the story of Jesus became known, before the life of Jesus, no one would have said, oh, this is a chapter about the Messiah who has to be betrayed by a close friend. Absolutely no one would have arrived at that conclusion. It's simply because of this one verse that is a soundbite that sounds like the story of Jesus that Christians suddenly see this chapter as a messianic prophecy. Of course, verse 5 in this chapter, or verse 4 in a Christian Bible, would totally disprove this assertion, meaning that their error is exposed by verse 5 in the chapter, where the speaker, the one who will say 5 verses later, but the one that ate of my bread has turned his heel against me, that same person says in verse 5, as for me, I said, O Lord, be gracious to me, heal my soul, for I have sinned against you. So Christians will basically reject the idea that this could be possibly Jesus speaking, because they can't imagine Jesus would confess to God that he sinned against God. And also we have to appreciate that it's totally absurd to say that this is a messianic prophecy that helps you, that was given to help us identify the Messiah. Meaning the assertion of the missionary is that God gave us clues in the Hebrew Bible so that we'd be able to identify the Messiah. And this is one of the clues, that he'd be betrayed by a close friend. The problem is that this is a clue that applies to virtually every human being that ever lived. Every person on the planet has probably been betrayed and let down by a close friend at some point in their life. So something that applies to virtually every human being is not a very helpful way of identifying the Messiah. In any event, in verse 49, moving on, we're told that when those who were around him saw what was going to happen, meaning when his disciples who were around him saw what was going to happen, meaning that he was about to be arrested, they said, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? Now, this is hard to understand, Because according to John, chapter 18, verse 3, Judas was accompanied. I mean, who came after Jesus in this story? So according to John, Judas was accompanied by a Roman cohort. Now, a Roman cohort was usually numbered around 600 soldiers. 600 soldiers. Plus, we're told there were security officers of the high priest. All of these people armed, carrying clubs and torches and swords. And Jesus was accompanied by perhaps a dozen or so men. Maybe some of them may have had a sword. So were they serious when they were asking if they should fight? I mean, what kind of fight would this be? You know, they would pick up a sword and all of them would have been offed in 2 seconds. Normally, in a situation like this, there is no time to ask, meaning if they were even thinking about using their sword to defend Jesus, they wouldn't stop and ask him, hey, boss, should we take up the sword? They just would have acted. They would have, on impulse, acted to protect Jesus. But if they did, it would have been a certain suicide. So in verse 50, we're told that there was a certain one of them, again, John identifies him as Peter, who struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his right ear. So he takes his sword and cuts off the right ear of the high priest's servant. And it's interesting that Peter may have been one of the people that just asked Jesus, should we use our swords? But Peter in the story doesn't wait for an answer. That's another peculiarity here. They stop to ask Jesus, should we use our sword? And without waiting for Jesus to say anything, Peter lops off the ear of the high priest's. He lops off the servant of the high priest's ear. So why bother asking Jesus in the first place if you're not going to wait for his answer? In verse 51, Jesus then answers after the fact and says, stop, no more of this. So Jesus doesn't want any fighting going on, and he touched the ear of the high priest's servant and healed him. Now, this is the account that we read in the book of Luke, that after Peter chopped off the right ear of the high priest's servant, Jesus touches his ear, or touches where the ear used to be, and he heals him. Now, this is very interesting. Luke chapter 1, verses 1 to 4, says that he was not really an eyewitness. Luke says that he is creating his gospel based upon research that he did. He went and spoke to other people, and he put together his account based upon the reports that Luke heard from other people. So Luke is not claiming to be an eyewitness, yet what's interesting is that Luke is the only gospel reporting that Jesus healed the ear of the high priest's servant. The other three gospel writers, who ostensibly are eyewitnesses, they would have been more aware of what was going on. They don't report anything about Jesus healing the ear of the high priest's servant. It's pretty peculiar detail here. Now in verse 52, Jesus said to those who had come for him, have you come out with swords and clubs as against a robber? He's saying, like, why did you have to come armed to the hilt with so many people to come for me? Why? Now, that's a pretty weird question. Because again, we have to remember that, well, let's put it this way. Jesus seems surprised here that they've come armed to arrest him. But we have to remember that according to Luke and the other synoptic gospels, this is taking place late at night on the holiday of Passover, after the Passover Seder. That's when this is all taking place. Everybody is probably tired from all of the preparations for the Passover holiday. Passover was not the kind of holiday you just slid into. There was a lot of preparation for it. And everyone has gone through all those preparations. Everyone has gone through the Passover Seder. It's now probably pretty late at night. And especially for the priests, who were very, very busy slaughtering Passover sacrifices all afternoon. And now everyone is going to drag themselves to the Mount of Olives to arrest Jesus. I mean, the whole story itself, forget about why you coming armed to arrest me like a robber. The whole story sounds peculiar. It doesn't pass the smell test that this is going to be happening late at night after the Passover Seder. And why would Jesus be so shocked anyway? Why would he be so shocked that they came to arrest him armed? He was the one, Jesus was the one, who commanded his followers to arm themselves. So wouldn't the people coming to arrest him also be armed? And normally security forces and Roman cohorts were always armed. You know, he's seeing here a cohort of Roman soldiers. They didn't usually walk around, you know, in their civies and unarmed. So just the fact that he's so shocked that he's meeting up now with armed people to arrest him, it's peculiar. And in verse 33, Jesus says, "While I was with you daily in the temple, you did not lay hands on me." Now, this is really going to sound strange. Jesus says to those arresting him, wait a second. He says, I was with you every day in the temple, and you never laid hands on me. But this hour and the power of darkness are yours. Now, the truth is that there were plenty of opportunities prior to this time to have Jesus arrested, when we think about it. First of all, when Jesus is marching into Jerusalem with his disciples, and we're told that there were large crowds greeting him as the Son of David, Hosanna, the Son of David. They were basically not two or three people greeting him as the Jewish Messiah. The Gospels portray massive crowds that were greeting him outside of Jerusalem, coming into Jerusalem as the Son of David, as the Messiah. Now, this would have been extremely provocative to the Roman security forces. Again, we have to understand the context that the Romans were normally very skittish about Jewish rebellions. The Romans understood that the Jewish people did not appreciate them being in Judea and occupying the land of Israel and having all their pagan symbols in the faces of all the Jewish people. The Jewish people were fiercely independent-minded. They did not like being occupied by Rome. The Romans knew that the Jews could always be fomenting rebellion against them. And so they were always on the lookout. The Romans were always on guard, but especially during the Jewish holidays, because during the 3 pilgrim festivals, there was a biblical commandment that everyone had to come to Jerusalem to sacrifice in the temple. So there were huge crowds, massive crowds in Jerusalem at the times of the holidays. And so we're told, that Josephus mentions this and other sources, that the Romans increased their security forces. They brought in massive numbers of people to be on the lookout for any signs of rebellion. So here you have a very, very provocative scene where Jesus comes riding into Jerusalem and the massive crowds are screaming, Hosanna, Son of David. Well, that would have been something that Jesus should have been arrested on the spot. Now, it's hard to say that, well, there were no Romans around. The Romans were all over the place looking for exactly this kind of thing. But for some reason, it slips their attention. The Romans don't notice this entry into Jerusalem, what the Christians call the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. But then Jesus, shortly afterwards, causes a riot in the temple itself, by taking a whip, we're told, taking a whip and turning over the tables of the money changers and using the whip to chase out the money changers. This would have been a very public disturbance. And this would have aroused the excitement, and it would have certainly aroused the guards of the priesthood. And certainly there would have been Romans in the area. So the fact that Jesus basically is able to walk through these two very public events and very provocative events, and no one bats an eyelash, and there's no concern, is very, very bizarre. So it would really lead us to believe that the whole story of Judas's betrayal with a kiss was really unnecessary. You didn't need Judas to go and kiss Jesus for the priesthood and the security forces and the Romans to be able to know who Jesus was. He wasn't hiding the whole time that he came into Jerusalem. The whole episode of Judas Iscariot betraying Jesus with a kiss has the ring of myth or fiction. And there's a very important book that I recommend reading, written by Chaim Maccoby, who wrote a number of other important books on the Christian Bible that are really important. One was called The Revolution in Judea, another one about Paul called The Mythmaker, Paul and the Invention of Christianity. But he has another important book called Judas Iscariot and the Myth of Jewish Evil. And he makes a strong case for how this literary fiction of Judas Iscariot, again, of all the names, Judas, is calling to mind the Jews. Judas the Jew. After all, Judas is short for Judah, and Judah is basically derived from the tribe of Judah, and the place where we basically were centered here is Judea, all connected. This is all the land of the Jews, the name of the Jew here. And Maccoby makes a strong case for how this whole story is basically a literary fiction that was planted, concocted in the gospel narrative as part of an ongoing attempt to shift the blame for the death of Jesus away from Rome and towards the Jews. So this, again, is a book I highly recommend. And again, it really sounds, to me at least, like this betraying Jesus with a kiss story is not really historical. It's more of a literary fiction. In verse 54, we're told that having arrested him, they led him away and brought him to the house of the high priest. But Peter was following at a distance. And then in verse 55 and verse 56, we're told that after they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard, don't forget, this is the middle of the night. Again, the Passover Seder begins at nightfall. So they had their Passover Seder, and then they go to the Garden of Gethsemane, and now they're in the courtyard of the high priest's house. This is all in the middle of the night. And that's why Jesus is going to speak now. Now we're going to have the story of Peter betraying Jesus 3 times before the cock crows, because it's still nighttime. So they have a fire kindled in the courtyard because there was no other light that was there. It wasn't light outside yet. So we're told that they kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard, and they sat down together, and Peter was sitting among them. And then it says, a certain servant girl, seeing him as he sat in the firelight, and looking intently at him said, "This man was with him too." Meaning this guy here, pointing to Peter, he was with Jesus as well. Now, it's very, according to my understanding, very unlikely that this servant girl would have seen Jesus with Peter. She certainly wasn't with them at the Passover Seder. And it's very unlikely that she was with them in their private meetings. So the idea that she, in a sense, is able to say, "Oh, I know that this guy over here, this Peter fellow, he was with Jesus," it's very unlikely. And it's now the middle of the night, and the crackling fire of this fire that's burning doesn't provide the clearest light to be able to distinguish faces. As I recall from my childhood memories sitting around the campfire, when it's dark outside and all you have is a crackling campfire burning, you don't really see faces clearly around the campfire. So it's just very peculiar that this servant girl is able to ID Peter so clearly. But the enemies of Jesus, the high priest and the Sadducees and the Romans, they're not able to ID Jesus. Even after all of the public appearances he made, they're not able to ID Jesus. They need, strangely enough, Judas to kiss him in order to be able to say, "Oh, this is the guy we're looking for." Again, these stories do not pass the smell test. In verse 57, "But he denied it." Peter denied having been with Jesus, saying, "Woman, I do not know him." I don't know this Jesus fellow. And then within an hour, we're told, two other people identify Peter as an associate of Jesus. And the third saying, "It has to be," right? Why does the third one know that Peter must be an associate of Jesus? Because they say, because he is also a Galilean. He doesn't say that I saw them together. He says that this guy must be an associate of Jesus because he's also a Galilean. Now, number one, how in the world would he know that that Peter is a Galilean, just seeing them sitting there? Now, some Christian commentaries say, well, he heard Peter speaking and he heard his accent, which might have been a Galilean accent. But even so, just because a person's from the Galilee doesn't mean they're a disciple of Jesus. So it just doesn't make any sense. In verse 60, "And after the third time Peter denies knowing Jesus, a cock crows." And this little episode as well does not pass the smell test. It just sounds too pat and too good to be true, that Jesus predicts that you're going to deny me 3 times. I mean, it's not a normal thing to deny someone 3 times. And then as soon as he does it, as Jesus predicted, the cock's going to crow. And then we're told in verse 66, "And when it was day, the council of elders of the people assembled, both chief priests and scribes, and they led him away to their council chamber." Now, in Matthew chapter 26 and Mark chapter 14, the trial of Jesus takes place while it's still night. This is a major discrepancy between Luke's account here and the other 2 synoptic gospels. So in Matthew and Mark, the trial of Jesus takes place at night, and it's only after that nighttime trial, does Peter deny knowing Jesus 3 times, and then the cock crows, signaling the beginning of the day. But in Luke's story, it's Peter denying Jesus 3 times, then the cock crows, then the day comes, and then there's the trial before the Sanhedrin. Again, very confusing testimonies. Secondly, there's been a tremendous amount of literature, entire books written about the alleged trials of Jesus. The problems with the gospel accounts of the trial of Jesus are legion, absolutely legion. I'll mention a few now, and maybe we'll mention a few later on. First of all, the Sanhedrin didn't convene on a Jewish holiday. This is the holiday of Passover. This is the first day of Passover. The Sanhedrin never convened on a Jewish holiday. Secondly, the Sanhedrin never convened at night. And again, in Matthew and in Mark, that's when the Sanhedrin meets to try Jesus. And thirdly, the Sanhedrin certainly didn't convene to interrogate someone about whether or not they claim to be the Messiah. This is the question they posed to Jesus in verse 67. They ask him, "Are you the Christ? Are you the Messiah?" In Jewish law, it's not a crime to claim to be the Messiah. If a person claims to be the Messiah, it is not a crime. The only people who would have been concerned about someone claiming to be the Messiah would have been the Sadducean priests, who were basically in bed with the Roman authorities. And they would have seen anyone claiming to be the Messiah to be a threat to the political status quo and the political stability. Because again, the Messiah is claiming to be the king of Israel. The king of Israel means we don't accept Roman rule. You guys are going to be out soon, you Romans. Well, that would have been a very, very disturbing thing to the Sadducean priesthood, who were, again, basically in cahoots with Rome. But for the rest of the Jewish people, literally everyone else at that time, the Pharisees, the scribes, the elders, the masses of people, there was a tremendous longing for the Messiah to come, who would restore sovereignty to the Jewish people. That's what people were looking for. That's what people were hoping for. That's what people expected. We see this, by the way, was exactly what the disciples of Jesus were looking forward to. We're going to see in a few weeks in Luke chapter 24, verse 21, when the allegedly resurrected Jesus appears to two of his disciples, and they don't recognize him, and they say to him, "What?" They say, "We were hoping that it was he who would redeem Israel." That's what they were hoping for. They weren't saying we were hoping that he was going to die for our sins. They were saying what we were hoping for was that he was the one that was going to redeem Israel. And then we see in the book of Acts, chapter 1, verse 6, where they say to the resurrected Jesus, "Is it at this time you're going to restore the kingdom to Israel?" So this is not something that would have been controversial among the Jewish people. This was exactly what the Jewish people were hoping for and waiting for. And then in verses 70, 71, this is the end of the chapter now, they all said, meaning the people in this kangaroo court, said to him, "Well, are you the Son of God then?" He sort of gives a coy answer when they ask him, "Are you the Messiah?" He says, "You wouldn't believe me if I told you anyway." So now they ask finally, "Are you the Son of God?" And he said to them, basically, "Yes, I am." And they said, "What further need do we have of testimony? For we have heard it ourselves out of his own mouth." Now, I'll just mention a few more inconsistencies with Jewish law and what is presented here in the gospel accounts. First of all, in Jewish law, capital cases were never decided immediately. There were at least 2 days of deliberation, and they had to deliberate over one evening. So this is a case where they bring him up in front of a court, and within 2 seconds they pronounce him guilty. That's not the way courts operated. Secondly, if the court ruled unanimously, according to Jewish law, the person was acquitted. Any unanimous conviction, the person was acquitted. There was an assumption that if everyone voted against someone, there must have been some collusion and there must have been some plotting, because it's impossible that you'd have a Sanhedrin and no one came up with a defense. No one came up with a way of maybe clearing this person. That was just considered to be unreasonable. So in any trial where the jury was unanimous, the person was acquitted. Number three, the Sanhedrin at this time in history was not trying capital cases, meaning we know that at this point in time, the Sanhedrin was not trying capital cases. Number four, a person could not be convicted of a capital crime based upon their own confession. A confession was not admitted as evidence to convict someone of a capital crime. There had to be two witnesses. And yet here the Sanhedrin says, look, we heard it out of his own mouth. We don't need any more witnesses. This is totally at variance with the way Torah law worked. And finally, to say that I am the Son of God would not be considered blasphemy. Blasphemy is not a word that appears in the Bible or in the Talmud. It's an English translation of the Hebrew. And the Hebrew is very interesting. The Hebrew is so allergic to the even saying of blasphemy that we use a euphemism. We say the opposite. The Hebrew term for blasphemy is Berach Hashem, to bless God. It's the opposite. Many times in Jewish law, we will use a word that's the opposite to express something, because we don't want to speak about something directly. So for a person to say that they are the Son of God would not be considered blasphemy according to Torah law. According to Torah law, blasphemy is only if a person curses God using the tetragrammaton, meaning they had to pronounce the holy four-letter name of God that was never pronounced. That's what they had to say. They couldn't say Hashem or God or any other term that's used to describe God. That would not constitute blasphemy. Blasphemy had to have these two ingredients. They had to use the formal tetragrammaton name of God, and they had to curse God with that name. So for a person to say, I'm the Son of God, is not considered blasphemy according to Jewish law. Now, there are many, many other inconsistencies between the gospel accounts of the trial of Jesus and the way Judaism was practiced and Torah law. It would, again, there are entire books devoted to this topic. But again, when we read the story, those who understand how Judaism operates and how Torah law operates, these stories really read more as fiction, as myth, than as true accounts, as actual accounts of history. Okay, Kimasabi, that's a big chapter.
All right. It was.
The next chapter is also big.
Probably going to be a two-parter.
No time to breathe here.
There you go. All right. Well, guys, thank you all for tuning in. Be sure to hit that like button. Share these videos with your friends, and turn on the notifications to the YouTube channel so you don't miss any insights from shows and stuff. So we'll let you go now, Rabbi.
Even share them with people who are not your friends.
Yeah, right, for sure.
Maybe you'll make friends.
There you go.
Maybe you'll make enemies.
Yeah. Very good. Okay, Rabbi, thank you so much for your time, and thank you all. We'll see you same time, same place next week. Hashem willing. Thank you.
If you enjoy this channel and the content, and it has changed your life, or perhaps the life of a loved one or a close friend, would you please consider supporting this work? You can click this link and it'll take you directly to my website with the donate button. Or there's a Patreon link and a mailing address for snail mail if you would prefer. If you do donate, please do me a favor and leave me a phone number where I can contact you and thank you properly. I hope you all have a wonderful 2025. Shalom.